Welcome, everybody. This is RISE Learning Machines Seminars, and I am Olof Mogren. RISE is Sweden's research institute with over 3,000 people working on a wide array of topics. Computer science department works on applied AI projects for the benefit of society, and we organize these weekly learning machines seminars. This meeting will be recorded, and if anyone wants to be removed from this recording, just let us know. And make sure to check out the collection of great talks we have on our YouTube channel. Talks on AI topics ranging from ecology to computer games. Today, I have the pleasure to introduce Ben Weinstein, who is a postdoctoral fellow at University of Florida. Ben is located in Portland, Oregon, and that's why we have this non-standard time today. It's 7 a.m. where Ben is today, so we thank him very much for getting up this early. Ben Weinstein obtained his PhD in ecology and evolution from Stony Brook University in 2016, and he is doing his postdoc at University of Florida on mechanisms that generate, maintain, and preserve biodiversity. And the topic today is general models for airborne wildlife detection. Where are we and where are we going? With this said, I will stop my screen sharing and hand over the word and the sharing to you, Ben.
Awesome. So let's share desktop 2, and then we'll screen share. Go to the top of the talk. Excuse me. Can we see my screen all right?
Yes, looks good.
Excellent. All right, so I'm just gonna start my timer, make sure I'm on time. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate your time. I'm gonna talk today about general models for airborne ecological monitoring. I played around a little bit with the topic here today, given the audience. And so what I think I'm gonna do is a kind of general review at the top and think about some bigger questions that we have as a field. And you may not be an ecologist, you may not be a machine learning scientist, but I hope that you can see some of the themes that we're starting to reach to are really applicable to a broad set of audiences interested in data science development and remote sensing, in just how we start to build community around emerging technologies. And so you're welcome to stop me anytime if you prefer, or you're happy to take questions at the end. Either way, I'm very flexible. And yeah, with that, we're gonna jump right into it. So for those of you who are now ecologists, I think it's worth starting at the very top, which is, why do we need computer vision models for ecological data collection? Like, why is it that we need to do this at all? Why is human data collection and what's happened in the past not sufficient? And I think it boils down to 4 things for me, which is that ecological processes, the mechanisms that generate biodiversity, for example, are highly noisy and they're difficult to measure over small spatial and temporal scales, which means we need a lot of data. The presence of humans in the environment often creates a very strong detection bias and limits our ability to observe the things we want to see. We also have very rare effects that may happen sporadically that could have a disproportionate large effect. And from the economic side, there are weak incentives for conservation, which means that we need a lot of data, but it needs to be collected at low cost. Human surveys are very expensive, and developing kind of expertise, especially in taxonomic expertise, can take a lifetime. And so I'm going to talk today a little bit about predicting individual organisms from remote sensing. I'm going to be talking exclusively today about airborne remote sensing, except for the sort of review part here, because it's the only thing I'm sort of qualified to talk about. But I want to point out that the improvements we've made over the last 10 years we're probably really led by camera traps, by audio recorders, by ground-based terrestrial sensing. In a lot of ways, the airborne work has been slow to follow up, and we're trying to catch up with what a lot of the terrestrial work is. But I think the general questions I pose today relate to ecology as a whole, and frankly, a lot of different machine learning fields, application fields, as we think about how we continue to improve. So in 2017, really 2016, when I was a graduate student, I wrote this review paper because I didn't know anything about computer vision and I wanted to learn, which I think is the best reason to write a review paper. And so we had this general question, which was like, what is happening in computer vision circa 2016? And there were these isolated little examples of people often coming from computer science or other hard science backgrounds coming into computer vision and coming into ecology and kind of combining them together to create individual one-off examples of object detection, of classification, and underwater imagery, and airborne imagery, and camera traps. And it was a very sort of sporadic, sort of low intensity field at the time. I would say in the last 5 years, we've seen a tremendous, probably 2 orders of magnitude increase in the interest and output of computer vision in biological sciences and in ecology in particular. And so I wanted to think a little bit about what we've learned in those few years. So there's a great review by the wonderful author Devis Tua, whose work is fantastic and whose last name makes me nervous to say out loud because I don't know how to say it. Their work has really helped us understand kind of the general landscape. I highly recommend this review by him and Ben Kellenberger and Sarah Beery. And I think one of the things we've seen at a broad scale is we have real progress on individual fields and individual sites and individual applications, and really showing what computer vision for ecology can be. We have object detection, classification. If everyone hasn't seen Deep Lab Cut, I highly recommend it, which is segmenting in into 3D points or into key points from objects. We have airborne and thermal imagery. There's some nice examples of tracking in labs. This was an ant tracking. We also have tracking in active landscapes. This was like an elephant movement study, as well as audio intensity recordings. And so we're starting to get it from all angles, different remote sensing techniques that are combined with computer vision to really improve the kinds of analysis we can make. There has been a tremendous collaboration between industry, academia, and nonprofits. I don't know how well it's applied to Sweden and Northern Europe, but I highly recommend the Seek app by a naturalist. If you haven't seen it, and it's a machine learning app that you can hold up to, especially vegetation, and get a provisional ID for tens of thousands of plants. I use it almost every day. It's fascinating and incredibly well done. Merlin by the Cornell team and Grant Van Horn in particular has been a real leader in, again, the US on bird identification and just showing what is possible. And I feel really indebted to these teams to show the vision and how far we can take this, especially at a global scale. Open Soundscape is an audio recording and analysis package in Python by Justin Kitsis at the University of Pittsburgh that I highly recommend. And the Mega Detector from Microsoft and Sarah Beery and a bunch of other people as well, Siu Yang, looking at global object detection classification techniques for camera trap imagery. And then sort of my 2 contributions so far, which have been Deep Forest and Motion Meerkat and Deep Meerkat for video analysis and airborne analysis. And the interplay here between nonprofits, I work with the Nature Conservancy and all sorts of different parts of the federal government in the US, the Fish and Wildlife, as well as we have meetings pretty regularly with members of Google and Meta staff, from formerly Facebook staff. There is a tremendous amount of foment happening here that I think is part of the really exciting way forward as we try to engage all partners in really difficult technical questions. One of the things I want to sort of say about the last 5 years, which is, I think, somewhat counterintuitive and probably different than what a lot of people expect, is you might think that the reason we've made so much progress in the last 5 years is because of some kind of magical increase in model quality, of that, like, suddenly models were just a lot better than they were, in 2017. This is fundamentally untrue. The improvements we've made are often because of simple models and exceptionally well done design, data collection, and community building. I want to highlight that this is not to say that there is no room for algorithm development. There are absolutely very difficult technical questions left. But when we look at the improvements, especially the ones I labeled on the last slide, none of them are using something incredibly cutting edge, or at least when they use something incredibly cutting edge, it's not materially or stratospherically different than an off-the-shelf model that we had available to us. And so one of the things I want to impart to you, especially for your field, and I'm interested in getting feedback from other people's field as well, whether this is true in other places. I've talked to astronomy people, and this is the similar thing they say, which is that choosing a simple model and iterating toward success, building training and test splits slowly, seems to be a common strategy that is probably worth more than really intense algorithm development, at least when we're trying to reach towards global scale. And so my whole thesis, in a lot of ways, is that data plus workflows plus community is where our scientific progress is. We have a Slack channel started by Sarah Beery and Dan Morris called AI for Conservation. That's very active. I posted a link to this talk this morning there, and you got a bunch of replies within 15 seconds. And it is the reason that I stay in the field in a lot of ways, is that I have peers who are dedicated to this work. And so creating community is always valuable in making machine learning science sort of better and more rigorous. And I really value this part of the job. I threw a little poll in there I think this was last fall, because I was writing a bunch of grants. I'll ask this question in a second, but I'm always interested in people's general perspective on, okay, what is it we need to make ecology and AI sort of better together? And what I like about this little poll, which I only took in sort of like an hour, is that there was a lot of disagreement, which I think is really valuable and show why this is so interesting and having community is so important. I strongly vote for one of these categories. I guess I won't say, but the fact that we had participants coming in really quickly and be like, oh no, I don't think it's this thing, shows just the diversity within the community. And I often think about this question at a broad scale, which is like, do we need better models, better data, or better theories for machine learning and ecology to get to a future that I think is the most important one, where we have plentiful models, so models that you could download weights, any time of day in just a quick click, where you would be able to just fine tune for a small amount of classes. I'm thinking about annotating, let's say 100, 200, 300 images, something you could do in a day. And it would generalize well and freely available to multiple languages and a wide audience. How do we get to that future where this is a common thing that we're just doing daily? I guess I'll reveal my answer a little later, but I think it's important asking for your field how we move towards this future and which of these three things. Look, all of them are important. It's one of those answers that you could say all of them. But given that you only have so much time, you have to choose a little bit. And you're making a choice every day about what you're working on. So I think it's really important to take a stance. Do we need better models, better data, or better theory? And while of course they're not mutually exclusive, I think that there's an important in trying to actually decide what it is that you think is the most important thing moving AI forward in your field. We've also learned that the difference between excellent computer vision research and ecological application is really sort of stark. I'm putting this slide up. I don't normally put other people's work up like this, but I can put this up because this is a very good paper. This is a very important and interesting paper on tree detection. But what I want to highlight for you, and this is what we see often, is the difference between their work, which probably took a year or a year and a half to develop a three-dimensional airborne LiDAR point cloud convolutional neural network, and faster RCNN, which was available like 2018, is about 2.5 percentage points. And that is in no way denigrating the excellent work that they did, only just showing you how hard those diminishing returns are. And so a lot of my sort of philosophy is driven by these observations. And again, they may not be shared in other fields, but I'd be interested either in chat or at the end, whether in other fields we see this similar challenge. Because for me, a lot of times, it's most times just about data. And it's the beginning of the end of it. And so here's an example from our own work. We were tasked with creating a global bird detector. So if you had an RGB image and you needed to know where the birds were in that image and count them, we did nothing that was interesting except for contact all the people we knew who had bird pictures and get them to annotate that. we were able to get 250,000 annotations just from a small group of people that we knew. And we got a model which performs reasonably well. 84% recall and 69% precision is just a generally interesting model at a global scale for a taxa that, of course, you're going to need to fine tune. I really don't believe there's a future in some sort of foundational model that doesn't involve fine tuning. I've yet to really see that as a future in such a complex set of problems. But as a backbone, with 1,000 new annotations, which might take you 2 days, you're in a place that you're in totally different than from starting from ImageNet's weights. And we published this last year, and it's been a lot of interesting feedback, especially from the wildlife management community, in trying to make this sort of available to a wide audience. And so a lot of times the data is really where it is. This is my only text-heavy slide, but it's something that I've been thinking a lot about. So I'm just sort of putting out there as I continue to, I've been working on a new benchmark data set, which I'll mention in a second. And like, where is it we think we're going? Well, in the last 5 years, we've had a lot of single site examples of machine learning models, by which I mean that someone has collected some data at some location, annotated some amount of data, and then predicted at that same location, usually with a single hardware, let's say one drone, and assessed the evaluation on that kind of project. This is challenging because literally no one is going to do that again. If someone was going to take your model, they would never, for example, use your already collected drone data. At the very least, they would collect new drone data at that single site. But much more likely, they're going to take your model and use it for a new site. But you've never evaluated for that. What is your evaluation really telling you if no one is going to use the data in the same kind of way or the model in the same kind of way? And so often we see a lack of sensible baselines, where either no baseline at all, where someone will just generate a model and say, this is the performance. And we need to push as editors and reviewers to have really sensible baselines and say, like, what is this different than it's already available out there? And it really push authors to spend equal amount of time on their baselines as they do in hyperparameter testing, for example, as they do with their paper and their target focus. Because often with hyperparameter sort of sweeps and all this kind of work, you can get a lot of bounce in your improvement in your models when frankly, you just like ran the baseline once. And so it looks a lot different. We have this challenge in ecology in particular that we have strong spatial bias. So if you have training and test splits, which are randomly taken from your environment, very often they are just interrelated. And so you get an improvement in performance just from having train and test be close in geography. So really try to enforce as reviewers and editors having a spatial block design and as far apart as train and test as possible. We've seen this in our tree classification work. You can get about a 15% bounce in accuracy by just moving train closer to test in geographic area. Still not touching, but the autocorrelation in spatial bias gives you a lot. And I think we need to be more serious about open source code and model sharing. Very few papers really are making the effort to make their models available, even fewer their data available. And it's 2023, it's almost 2024. I think, again, it's up to the journals and the editors to be much more aggressive about this. One of the things I've been thinking about a lot, which I'll talk about in a second, is that when we've been designing data sets and projects, we've really been trying to think about them with respect to current model architectures. So we often do points prediction or polygon prediction or raster prediction. And we think about them in totally separate environments because the models currently are separate than other types of geometric representations. But a model which can predict the location of trees, like as a point, should also be reasonable and interesting as a model which can predict the crown area, the backbone of that. And so right now we've been designing data sets and papers around this idea of single geometric representations of objects of interest, when I think as humans, we would not think about, oh, like, well, I put points on boxes. Actually, I put boxes. That's totally different. And we need to get more serious about generalization again across focal views, resolutions, band numbers. I think these are the ways in which we move forward as a field. Lastly, I think that in 2023 and as we move into 2024, this idea that we show one-off examples of certain training regimes needs to be improved. It's not about if self-supervision works. We know sometimes self-supervision works, or semi-supervision, or transformers. It's trying to come up, at least this is getting to the theory aspect of a predicted theory about when these things work. If I have a data set, can I tell when semi-supervision is going to be useful, when self-supervision is going to be useful. How do I know when it's worth trading off complexity in my model for more annotations? These kind of trade-offs and thinking about the situations when they work is going to be much more useful because we already know that these tasks work sometimes. It's a question about how we now make choices because we don't have time to do everything. All right, that's enough of my monologue, but it's something I've been thinking a lot about, and I welcome feedback about the general view of these things. I want to talk a little bit about the work we've been doing with trees and kind of how I've been putting this into play. This is across a series of papers. I think it's like 6 or 7 papers. I couldn't put them all here. So if I show you a technical detail that you want to follow up on, please let me know and I can point you to the correct paper. But over the last few years, we've been working on tree detection and classification. The challenge here is to put a box around every tree in a landscape and assign it both a height as well as a species class. This has been a long-term goal and not something that you do in one paper. So it's been a sort of slow incremental progress. And I want to take you through a little bit of those steps that we have. But I want to first point out that we're at the end of this process in a lot of ways, and the data is up online. And so if you are a forest researcher looking for data, or you have students, I want to say that all of our models are open source. All the data is available. It is remarkable how often we have a meeting in which we generate 30 years worth of work that we're never going to do. And so if you have need for projects, especially among students, please let me know. We have so much data, and we would love to share it with you. The way this is going to work in this process is that we first have to detect crowns in landscapes. So we have to assign boxes to individual trees. We are going to assign them what I call a health status. I'm not allowed to call it live dead because trees may lose their leaves and then come back to life later when they bring their leaves back. And so that's not quite alive or dead. So we label them as leaf off during leaf on season, which is a little bit of a mouthful. Species prediction, and then mapping that across the whole landscape. And so this is a series of papers, but the end result is things that you look like this. This is, I think this is 1.75 million trees from one of the neon sites, labeled densely with boxes, and then each species. These are predictions, and we're not confused that every single box in this landscape is correct. But again, I like to take some inspiration from astronomy. We can't predict and classify every star in the galaxy, but trying is still worthwhile, and providing uncertainty bounds on it is still worthwhile. And so while in no way is every tree in this landscape correctly segmented into a crown and predicted correctly, this is the first step and a hypothesis that will allow us to start moving to broad scale ecology at unprecedented levels. For those of you in Europe who are not familiar with NEON, I highly recommend it as a source of data, if nothing else. NEON is a set of 40 sites in the US that collects 10 centimeter RGB, 1 meter HSI, and LiDAR near annually. We're at, 300 terabytes of data for remote sensing. It's a prime ground for self-supervision and unlabeled data learning across different remote sensing modalities because they are geo-rectified with respect to each other. And so we've talked to a number of authors interested in this. But if you want a very large co-registered remote sensing data set, we have this, and I'm happy to share how you download it. It's a little difficult to work with, but it's a very large scale data set. So kind of going all the way back now to the beginning in some ways and walking you through how I think about projects. Now that you have a sense of the general view, I want to talk about tree detection and this sort of first step in this project, right? So now that you've seen the end product, you have a general sense of why we're doing this and where we're going. But I think it's worth talking about the beginning and thinking about tree detection as a task. So here, what we're trying to do is draw boxes around individual trees from RGB data, usually at about 10 centimeter to 20 centimeter data. And that's difficult. I think it should be obvious. At a global scale, trees have a variety of appearances, taxonomically, background, light shadowing, all sorts of challenges. In no way is this a unique and novel work. It's probably actually the most common remote sensing task in ecology. Going back to like the mid 1990s, there have been, without exaggeration, hundreds of papers on tree detection. And so one of the things we want to do is learn from previous work. There's a nice paper by John Williams from David Coombs' lab looking at LiDAR algorithms. In a lot of ways, this is what was very common, 5-10 years ago. And basically the way it works for LiDAR algorithms is a set of heuristic rules. And for those of you in other fields, you may notice this is the general trend in machine learning. You start with some handcrafted rules. In this case, okay, at top of a tree is the tallest point. If there's not another point within a certain distance, if that on a certain angle, call that a new tree. And you can imagine these are human-derived heuristic rules, which describe some set of tasks. The virtue of them is, of course, they're unsupervised besides a bunch of parameter settings. And so they can run very quickly and a very large scale. And so we wanted to use this to our advantage. And so what we did was we could use a sort of workflow design. Again, I think workflows are so important here, wherein we take airborne LiDAR data. We're going to make a canopy height model. So that's a rasterized version of that LiDAR data where each cell is a height. And we're going to use this LiDAR tree prediction algorithm idea. It's an unsupervised algorithm. In this particular case, we use one from the R LiDAR package from Carlos Silva in 2016. But basically, they're very similar, which is they have a set of heuristic rules. You can tune those rules, and they're going to generate putative tree locations, which is just a convex hull, which we turn into a bounding box. So the key aspect here is that we're then going to train an RGB deep learning model based on the left-hand side of this millions of times, right? We're going to generate a lot of data on this left-hand side. We're going to pre-train our RGB deep learning model. Then we're going to go back and use hand annotations to correct the pre-trained model based on people literally clicking on bounding boxes, mostly me, of trees across a wide landscape. I've clicked on probably 50,000 trees myself. I highly recommend clicking on 50,000 trees because it gives you a sense for why this is important. And then we're going to retrain that backbone to make our new tree prediction model. So two things are happening here, right? We have self-supervision or semi-supervision on the left-hand side. We have domain transfer from LiDAR to RGB, and then we have fine-tuning at the end. Those are sort of the three paradigms here that matter at the top. So why would this work? And again, I don't want to steal any credit here. In no way is this particularly novel at a broad scale. So I think it's important to dwell on why this would work rather than like, did it work, right? You know by the fact I'm giving a talk that it worked, but why did it work? And so there are two things that I think I try to use as metaphors. I have a 7-year-old kid and he's learning to read. And when you learn to read, what happens is you teach children letters and then words and then sentences and then phrases. You build up a vocabulary of tools so that they can eventually read books. What you don't do is hand a 7-year-old Shakespeare. And what I often see in deep learning models is people handing 7-year-old Shakespeare. They have completely naive models, ImageNet backbone, never seen a thing they're interested in before. They know what the color red is. And then you use incredibly expensive data you collected to train that model that has no idea about anything. And so I often see completely naive models plus very expensive annotation data. And I think about 7-year-olds and Shakespeare, right? What we want to do is build a vocabulary of objects of interest to make models much more ready for high quality data. Don't waste Shakespeare on 7-year-olds. And so what I think about this is not necessarily how important the LiDAR tree algorithm was, but it's building a tree vocabulary, which we then are going to fine tune. So the way this works is that the unsupervised algorithm does not perform particularly well. If it did, we wouldn't need anything else. It generates fairly low recall and precision, but it creates sort of putative tree boxes. We're going to do that side of the equation millions of times. I think for this first paper, it was something like 7 million times for putative tree locations. I have not run this, so I don't know the answer yet, but we are going back and doing this at a very large scale. This was a couple of years ago now, and Neon has collected tremendous more data. And I just generated 750 million, so 750 million putative tree locations in our data sets. I don't yet know how I'm going to train at that scale, but that's the virtue of this idea, right? So you're going to see 7 million boxes, but what happens when we go to 700 million boxes, I think is a big question. Does it fall off? What happens there? We don't know yet. But this is what the putative tree locations look like draped over the LiDAR, over the RGB. Remember, this is LiDAR algorithms, so it has no sense of spectral properties. So for example, this rock became a tree because it has no RGB information. And you could always tune these algorithms to be better on any individual image, but I'm talking about a continent's worth of forest data. And so no one hyperparameter is going to make these trees better or worse. It's just not possible. There's just only like 4 parameters, whereas a deep learning model has, 30 million parameters. So it's just a really different set of thing. This is the performance of the RGB algorithm trained on putative LiDAR-derived tree locations. So in some ways, I think I call this self-supervised, but I regret that. I should just call it weakly annotated. It's not really self-supervision. But back in 2019, the definition of self-supervision was somewhat more flaky. And so here we are. And so, right, we had a big question now, which was like, are we going to be able to move the weights at all with 40,000 hand annotated boxes, right? In terms of momentum, I know it doesn't involve actual physics, but in terms of momentum, like, is this line too fixed in place? And is a small number of boxes going to be able to move the weights in this space? And we were pleasantly surprised that it was. And so what we were able to show is that adding hand annotations to the data is able to move the self-supervised pre-training a noticeable amount. This is what it looks like to look at individual examples, is that if you have this is the performance of an unsupervised algorithm. Again, this is all tested data, so this is all out of sample data. Here's what the pre-training looks like. And actually, I always think that whenever I show this slide, and I've shown it a lot, I feel like I see the ghost of the pre-training regime here, right? You see this sort of over-segmentation from that, which was the dominant problem in this particular site for this particular parameter set. And this is the fine-tuned performance. And so not only does the box representation get better, but the confidence scores get higher as well. And so we're both reducing bias as well as increasing recall. We had to go and verify this in the field. Again, at one of those high-level things that I think are really important is going back to the field after you develop a model and generating new data to try to figure out how your model performed. And so we have people with iPads standing underneath trees trying to draw crowns from in the field on the data, staring up at the trees, which is a really difficult task. And again, should show that I don't actually think 100% performance here is the ceiling. I don't think it's possible. Humans can't do 100% performance even on individual trees. And so I think that our general 72% accuracy, and I like to keep this general because I don't believe in evaluation statistics and too much precision, right? It's one set of evaluation data. So I think about these as sort of general performances. I think 72% is pretty good, given that I don't think any 2 humans are more than 90% in agreement. And if your 2 human annotators are not more than 90% in agreement, then I think that could be seen reasonably as the ceiling performance in some way. And so this is 72% out of something, but it's definitely not 100%. We generated a lot of data from our algorithm that we made available. This is online right now, should you want to download 104 million tree locations for all the neon data across the United States. These data have height and crown width and are available for biomass studies. Naturally, the first thing people ask is, do we have species information for each of these boxes, which I'll get to in just a moment. But this first release was just crown information. We called it the Neon Crown Maps, and it was published in eLife maybe in 2021. And again, if you have questions here or interest in this, please download the data set. We would like you to use it. We feel excited when people use our data. So this could be used both for machine learning pre-training as well as ecology, and there's a lot of ideas there. We wrapped our data sets into an open source package, which is probably what I'm most known for, which we call Deep Forest. Deep Forest is a little bit of a funny thing wherein I thought we knew what we were studying, which is to make tree predictions at neon sites. But it turns out almost no one is actually doing that. Everyone's using it for their own data, as I said, which is not evaluated in that way. And so satellites, drone data, we've had people from South Africa, from Mozambique, from India, from Tonga, all over the world using it to generate data. And the challenge is that it hasn't been evaluated with respect to that at all. And so we're going back now to generate a new data set. And so I welcome feedback on how we make data sets, because this is sort of what I'm working on these last few weeks. I'm calling it the Million Trees Benchmark. And the goal is to try to collect 1 million either stems or crowns or boxes from all across the world in urban settings, in wildland settings, in suburban settings, to try to create a single benchmark across geometry types for tree localization. It'll have a variety of metrics, and we're thinking about how we want to build this and share it with the community. If you know of sources of tree data and people who might want to be involved, I've spoken to the Copenhagen group, the tree group, just recently this week. Maybe some of them are here. And it is a big new effort that I'm trying to put together. And I really want this to be community involvement. And so if there is people who are interested in contributing tree data, please let me know. I've just made a website and we're about 300,000. So we're about a third of the way there. And I'll probably be working on this all year. So stay tuned on that one. I'm going to talk briefly about our new set of species models that we're adding to those tree crown and boundary boxes. But I want to move through this kind of quickly and have a chance for discussion because I've raised a lot of questions here. And I don't want to throw too much technical detail at you because you may not be a machine learning modeler, or frankly, you may not be an ecologist and care about this particular model. And so one of the things that's important to point out with tree species classification is that we have very low sample sizes compared to the average machine learning model. Sometimes this gets referred to as barely supervised, which I find hilariously pejorative. Sometimes we're less than 10 samples per class. And the imbalance can be enormous. So for the most common class, you might have 5,000 samples. And for the rarest class, you might have 6. And so dealing with these kind of data are really challenging. And that's really one of the things that I'm interested in technical feedback is thinking about very imbalanced data and how we address it. I just sort of said this. We have a number of challenges. One of them, for example, is that our ground truth data are often stem points that have the label of the species, but then we have crown boxes. How to associate the label points with the crown boxes and making sure that there's a correct matching there is probably a lot of the challenge. I've heard it said that ecology does not have ground truth, it has ground rumors. And I think ground rumors is a better way of thinking about them. Like, I think there's a red maple here rather than this is a red maple. And so that's a better way of probably thinking about the kinds of work that we do. I won't go into too much technical detail, but for those of you who are used to looking at convolutional neural network designs, this is sort of our general workflow. To combat the massive imbalance, we're using a mixture of experts approach. So it's sort of a hierarchical set of models. It's not fun to work with because it's a series of models that have to pass data from one to another. We would like to get away from this. And so if you're interested in studying class imbalance at very strong scales, let me know, because this is satisfactory, but not pleasant. The way this works is that, for example, we take the dominant tree class at any given site, and we predict, is that tree or not? So let's say if we have one class that's way more common than everything else, you first start with a model that says yes or no to that one. Then we say, is it broadleaf or needleleaf, which is 2 big classes in ecology. Okay, if it's needleleaf, go to a needleleaf model. If it's go to a broadleaf model. Maybe bud out for this, in this particular example, we have an oak model. So this is a series of nested hierarchical classifiers, each of them a neural network, which makes predictions, which we then assemble together. We do this for each geographic site separately. So again, if we did this for 40 sites or 25 sites, we're ending with hundreds of models. It's not very fun to work with. It's not a great workflow. And it's one of the things we need to do better. Within each model, we have multiple years of data with multiple views of flights. And so we multi-temporal ensemble them together with some sort of spectral attention block. And that block is basically a series of convolutions with 1D spectral attention layers. I can talk about this more if there's interested in technical detail here, but what you need to know is that we have a hierarchical, multi-temporal, multi-expert model. It's really a lot. And so this is what we have so far, but we welcome feedback about how to do better. Just to give some general scores about how this works and how it breaks down. And one of the things that's important here is that we have a reasonable baseline. If you do a 2-dimensional convolutional neural network on the hyperspectral data, this is 369 band hyperspectral data. This is for just one site. We've done this for 25 sites now. You get reasonable accuracy. And by the time you get all the way down to a multi-temporal hierarchical spectral attention model, you gain about, it's about 15 to 20%. And that is good enough. One of the things that's really important is that you don't lose precision on our dominant class, right? Because most trees in the landscape are that dominant class. Sometimes I see papers that are looking at macro averaged accuracy, but they're not also looking at the performance of the top class. And you got to remember that in class imbalance situations, you can't lose the virtue of the top class because that's going to be most of your predictions. And so from a raw perspective, you have to balance both of those, micro and macro averaged. I'm happy to talk about this in more technical detail later, but I don't think this is the audience who wants it. So I'm happy to field questions later. We've done this for 25 sites, and in general, you get about 70 to 80% accuracy, 60% accuracy on the more difficult sites, 80% accuracy on the easy sites. And that seems to be the general state of flow right now for about 8 species or 10 species per site. We've done this and is now available. It's in review right now at PLOS Biology, but the maps are already up on Zenodo. Should you want to look at 100 million trees, it's on Earth Engine as well right now. And so for an ecologist, I think there's some interesting things happening here at a broad scale, which is how are the patterns changing at different spatial scales. In some sites, this is like a broadleaf forest in Virginia. We see what looks like almost a completely Poisson kind of point pattern and species, whereas here in the Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado, we have highly structured patterns at broad spatial scales. And so I'm interested, just as a macroecologist, about what makes these different patterns at different scales at different sites. Again, I don't have time to study any of this. And so should you want this data, it's already available online. It's interesting for a number of different applications, and we welcome use cases. Okay, I'm going to do one last little thing, change directions here, and go to really fine scales, because I promised to do both trees and birds. But again, this is sort of a general layer model about what we're doing and a different way of looking at computer vision for ecology. So we're part of this awesome project. The Everglades is an area of wetlands in the southern United States. It is highly managed, by which I mean that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has a set of dikes and canals which controls the water level. That water level is important both for wildlife habitat as well as drinking water and hurricane protection for the city of Miami. So there are billions of dollars in play here. And because there's so much sort of money in the system, we are funded to do a lot of fun stuff in terms of wildlife management and observation. This has been going on since the 1980s for bird counts in the Everglades. And we just joined this project maybe 4 years ago. It's part of a large team. And what we're doing is surveying wading bird communities in the Everglades to see how they're responding to changes in water availability. Again, this is managed water availability. And you think Morgan Ernest, who's the head of this project, and especially Lindsay Gardner, who's flying drones through the Everglades pretty much all the time from an airboat. So if you've never tried to land a drone on an airboat, I highly recommend it. And I have some videos of Lindsay swimming after or jumping into the water after drones that have landed in the water, which I highly recommend as watching that, which is super fun. Remember, there are like alligators and stuff. So, you know, it's hardcore stuff. So credit to Lindsay. What we're doing is surveying bird colonies. We are required for the South Florida Water Management District to count birds and see how they are performing in different water management scenarios. And the goal here, again, is to count all the birds in an image. And currently, the way this has been done since the 1980s is that people like Lindsay have to sit in a propeller plane, flying at very low altitudes, hanging out the window, basically, and counting birds. That's just not good data collection. It's just really dangerous for the pilot. It's really dangerous for everyone. We want to move towards automated counts with cameras strapped to the bottom of planes so they can fly much faster. And obviously, it's difficult to literally count birds from planes. Like, it just should be obvious. And so the images look like this. And what we need to do is put bounding boxes around all the birds. I mentioned briefly at the top the bird detector, which was the motivation for this work. We've labeled, I don't know, I think it's 78,000 birds in our images. And so we have a lot of data to play with for 6 species of importance, especially wood storks, which are part of the endangered or were part of the Endangered Species Act, no longer. And so a species of concern. You can see a lot of detail in these images. You can see nests, you can see eggs, you can see individual birds. And so there's a lot of computer vision play here. We have ground control points that we've nailed into the ground for georectification, which is super important for what we're trying to do, because what we're going to do is fly, for example, every week, and then overlay multiple weeks worth of imagery to look at things like detections in different locations. We can do a pretty good job at recall versus human detection. We're about 91% recall, 75% accuracy, which again, at scales of tens of thousands of birds is pretty good. and obviously much faster than humans. We can look at the counts of humans versus birds, and we're pretty close to accurate in terms of the raw numbers. It doesn't matter if you miss 5% of the birds, given how much faster we can do surveys, is part of the thing we're taking here. But the real juice here, the real thing that's exciting, is what we call bird. Morgan has a gift for naming things. And so if there's a bird, for example, in the same location, and we have them now georectified because of the ground control, among weeks, let's say out of 5 out of 8 weeks, there's a bird in the exact same location, that seems like a pretty good evidence of a nest, right? There's no reason why a bird would be literally sitting in the exact same location. And we have about 2 centimeter geospatial accuracy. And so we're using the repeat detections across weeks as a nest indication. And some of you already can tell where I'm going with this. We can do traditional population kinds of studies for nest success based on the bird idea. And so I love how often I have to say the word bird. Morgan made me do this years ago, and now it's like stuck. And so here, right, we have actual bird on a nest. You can see 2 eggs, and we draw this buffer around it. If there's a bird within, I think it was 4 out of 6 weeks, for example, we call it a nest. And then we can start studying the statistical properties of nest success based on bird detection across multiple weeks. We can start surveying tens of thousands of nests. And we're starting to ground validate this right now, and we're getting closer with it. I think we're at about, like, I would say 70% accuracy with bird. And these are a bunch of different sites. And this is really promising stuff for nest detection at broad scales. We're going to combine that with species classification, because we can use computer vision to simultaneously also classify the bird we see in that area. Again, we have massive class imbalance. So for some classes, we can do really well. For things like snowy egret, which honestly, the feet color is the best predictor, we're going to be a lot of trouble. And so there's a limit to what we are going to be able to do. But I think between 70 and 90% accuracy for species class is going to be really possible. And so we're working on all this right now. If you have birds that you want to study, I'm happy to reach out. Again, Deep Forest is part of that workflow, and we're happy to share all of our data and code there. And with that, I tried to hit 45 minutes, which I did exactly. And so we have 15 minutes for discussion. Thanks, everybody.
Great, thank you, Ben. Exciting stuff. While everybody thinks about what you're going to ask Ben, I'll start with a question on something you said sort of early on. You said sort of cramming the last couple percent out from making better algorithms. It's generally not worth the while.
Yeah.
And sort of aren't there places where this could be worthwhile? Sort of aren't there
for sure.
Where we aren't there yet.
Oh, for definitely. And not only that, but like I proved that in some ways because I did it myself, right? Like, of course, right, if we'd used a 2-dimensional CNN, which of course is an off-the-shelf thing, we would have been at 61% accuracy instead of 78% accuracy. A lot of times, though, there is this question about downstream uncertainty and how to best make sense of our results, and whether 13% improvement in terms of the raw score is not washed out by some other part of your workflow in terms of uncertainty is a big question in my mind. At the same time, of course, there is value here in algorithmic development. I only mean to say is that if 61% score performance was reasonable for you, like there was a year and a half between here and here, right? And so sometimes that's valuable, sometimes that's not. But I did this in a day and then this in a year and a half.
Yeah, and I totally understand that sort of putting hours into having the right data may sometimes be more worthwhile. But then again, sort of with this, the working with data thing, don't you think there could be ways of having algorithmic help with sort of the data flows? I mean, you were mentioning weak labels, and you were mentioning sort of mixture of experts. Those are sort of things to managing sort of limitations in the data, aren't they?
For sure. I think that's a really important point. And it sort of goes to what I was saying before about workflows. Using models as part of a workflow is so important because it's very easy to think you know where your model performance is best going to be improved. You're often wrong. It's really hard to anticipate of like, oh, I just need a few more images of this, or I need a, like, you know, and then suddenly you're like, oh, actually, the model's not improving at all. And letting the model tell you where it's going to improve is really valuable. And so I think active learning is really valuable. I will take it even a step further, which is we have money for, but we've never done it, is that taking active learning, so model-based data management in some way into the field is really valuable. So for example, we have this huge challenge, which is, imagine we have a model, and I would love feedback from people about this. Imagine we have a model, right? We know it's, let's say this is a 71% accurate model and there's 5 million trees which have been identified. How can and we put that model on a drone, right? So it's on the edge. How can we decide, or we can do it beforehand, which new trees to sample, right? Can a drone fly among the trees in the forest and start taking high definition photographs of individual trees that it thinks are putatively of importance, right? So now take active learning back into the field and say, okay, we need we know that this class in blue is very rare and we are not good at identifying it. Strap a high definition camera and fly on a quadcopter to those putative trees, circle around that crown, take a bunch of photos of it. Is that tree the putative class? And so what we would like to do is kind of active learning. This is sort of robotics but sort of engineering in some way, right? But we want to take active learning back into the field so that it's taking model predictions, assessing them. Now, the question for algorithm developers, which is really interesting, and if anyone here is an algorithm developer who's interested in this, let me know. What's the best strategy? Do you take the highest confidence ones of a class? Right now, you've got millions of things to choose from. Should you go look at, it's an order of operations thing. Should you take the prediction that's highest confidence and see if that's right? Does that have the most improvement performance? The lowest confidence? Do you take the most common class and take the lowest confidence one of the most common class? Potentially things that are hidden, right? That are being sucked into the most common class. These are all up to play for. Should you just fly around at random and just as many trees as possible, right? You could imagine a bunch of different mission planning scenarios for active learning in the field, and then ask, how does that improve model performance? And should someone want to do that, please let me know. We just don't have time to, but we actually already have funded to do it.
It sounds like we should set up a project around that because
right? Isn't it cool?
It's sort of yeah, absolutely. There's a question from Misha in the chat. One model for all types of birds, nests, or one model per bird type?
In this case, it's one model for all types of birds and nests. It is easier to navigate this in terms of an application. There is probably benefit always in this mixture of experts approach, but I have to confess it's very unpleasant as a developer. The more times you add models, the more chance you're going to mess something up. And so in general, we would love to move away from this mixture of experts approach, even though we do see consistently a bounce in performance. It's probably not worth the cost of paying a developer to spend all their time organizing all this stuff if you can do one model. So actually, in truth, one of the things we're going to do with the trees is try to break it down to one flat model and get rid of mixture of experts as soon as possible, because it's a headache to work with.
So it's the headache of working with it that you're sort of have a problem when we talk about this. It's not the sort of computational issues or something.
No, it's just organizing, right? If we have 20, let's say we have a series of 6 models at each site and 25 sites, right? That's 150 models to organize and hold on to and weights and make sure you track. It's not pleasant to work with. Whereas in some future world, we have one model, it would just be much more preferable. And so I'm always interested in things that save us time. And so having one model would not necessarily be any more important. It would just be save us time.
Yeah. Right. More questions from the audience. Alex Chan. You can unmute and you can speak. You can
Hello.
turn on your camera as well if you like.
Hey, Alex, what's going on?
Yes, just have thanks for the really nice talk, first of all, and just have a really quick question on kind of the general direction of computer vision and ecology and all that.
Yeah.
What do you think of the role of like GPU access in all of this? So like, as you imagine, as you know, with these models, you can train them with the cloud or whatever, but when you collect all these data, you have to do inference. Like when you do large scale deployments, like for people that have less resources, cannot afford GPUs, labs that cannot, like do you have thoughts on this? Like, how do we solve this problem actually? Because I don't know personally, like I don't know how to solve this problem other than money.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the first step is actually weirdly a statistical one, which is asking how much accuracy does your project really need? And this is sort of what I was trying to say before, is that if you have a downstream ecological task, which is really uncertain, the difference between a 60% accurate model and a 70% accurate model may not make any difference to your downstream biomass prediction or counting salmon or whatever it is. And so trying to understand through simulation usually how accurate your detection process needs to be to actually change the confidence intervals of your estimate, I think is really valuable, because if it doesn't need to be too accurate, right? Training on CPU for a few epochs, right, may get you pretty far, whereas training on GPU is obviously going to be better for longer. And so sometimes I think it's a question of how much do we really need for our given task. The other thing which I think is valuable in this space is that as we go, and this is why I went back to the slide here, as we move towards a future wherein we have large backbone models, training on CPU for fine-tuning for 500 annotations is totally different than training from ImageNet from scratch. And so that is a huge difference. And so while most deep forest users do have a GPU, I won't pretend like they don't, they usually have just one. And usually it takes, I would say, an hour to annotate and then train enough images to make your own site worthwhile. Now, you will get a lot more by annotating 10,000 and training for 2 days. But I think when we move towards a future where we have rapid model sharing, why should every shark researcher start from scratch like we haven't seen a shark before, right? Like it's crazy. But that's really what you see a lot in the field, especially in academic fields. And so I'm interested, like, are there any non-ecologists here, any astronomers, any like urban planners? What does your field look like in terms of data sharing and model sharing? Is there anyone here from like a totally other field? No one wants to take debate on that one.
I think there are many computer scientists here, and maybe people work with different data sources, but yeah. Are there anyone with experience of sort of non-ecological data?
No one wants to take that. I'll offer a separate question, which is for the computer scientists in the room, how do we best engage you in data set creation that speaks to the complexity of our tasks without making them so messy that computer scientists won't want to touch them? This is something we have to deal with the Million Trees benchmark, which is that it's nice to boil down things into a single metric. And so we can rank all models. And we all love these benchmark data sets that have a single metric. But tree detection as a class, right, is simply too complex and the data is too messy to study. And so we're going to have a series of metrics. I'm interested in, for example, how we better design benchmark data sets that engage computer scientists while still reflecting the complexity of the task and not oversimplifying it to make it, you know, kind of easiest to work with. So is there anyone in the room who wants to talk about that?
I think it sounds like really interesting data.
Yeah. One of the things that's we're struggling with, which is really interesting from computer vision perspective, is that very few people want to label every tree in an image. And so with normal object detection models, right, especially one-shot detectors, they're using implicitly background as negative. But here, there's lots of trees in the background that people are like, I didn't want to click on that one. There's just too many trees. And
Yeah.
so implicit negatives and weighting positive versus negatives is going to be part of this game that I think is going to be really valuable.
The annotation cost is actually something that we have initiatives around, and we're looking into active learning, and we're looking into the different cost of doing different annotations. So if you're too lazy to sort of put boxes around all the trees, perhaps you can just put a point on each tree.
Totally.
And we've looked into sort of suppressing the loss when your object detection model predicts a box where there is a point instead of a box, and things like that.
Yeah, we should actually connect on this because I think it's a really valuable part of this, and I think it's really valuable. All right, someone jumping in. John, go for it. I saw you turn your camera on.
Hey, yeah, so I just wanted to make some comments on active learning, and I think you brought up some really interesting perspectives on the sort of criteria on how we rank things. Should we do the highest entropy or the most uncertainty thing, the lowest?
Yeah, go for it.
And I think that, I mean, most disagreement-based active learning today, at least, do go for the highest entropy, because the oracle that is modeled, the noise from the oracle is sample independent, which obviously it's not in real life. I mean, if you get a hard example, you would get a worse label from an annotator. So I think there's some sort of non-trivial trade-off here where you might not want to choose the hardest sample to give to the annotator and not also the easiest example, because that gives very little information. So there's some sort of communication perspective going on between the machine and the annotator in some sense.
How do we usually define entropy?
So as the sample that the model would be most uncertain of.
But I mean, is it per class or for any class?
Yeah, so where the distribution is most uniform, I guess. I mean, the entropy. So if you have the same probability for every class, then you have the highest entropy. And if you have all the mass, the probability mass on one class, then you have the lowest possible entropy. And then you're the most confident. So it's based on a model, but I mean, assuming that samples that are hard for the model are also hard for annotators, then this sort of becomes problematic in practice. And I don't know, active learning does not really, at least from what I've seen, does not really take this into account. I mean, we assume perfect oracles, or sometimes sample independent noisy oracles, but sample dependent oracle noise.
We have an additional complexity, which is
probably some papers out there that do that, but I mean, I think it's definitely a non-trivial trade-off here.
And we have an additional complexity, which is that we're changing modalities during the oracle process. So in the prediction, it's hyperspectral, right? But what I'm talking about is strapping an RGB camera to a drone. And so it's a very high definition, and like maybe it would circle around the crown. And so actually the data content is different, where it's a cross modality. It's not that I'm using the same kind of data collection to go look at a crown, but I'm actually using a different data collection. And so there may be some equation which describes how well any given sample in the hyperspec can be then assessed in RGB, right? That we have an additional layer of challenge. Because of course, a human looking at the HSI data, it's meaningless. It's just a bunch of spectra, like we can't do anything with it. And so I would have a human review the drone data from the RGB crown and see if it can make a call. So there's like an additional layer of weirdness as well.
Yeah.
Other people, other interesting things. You know, I'm interested in kind of, again, how we engage computer science and think about these things, and as design data sets that bring in the widest possible audience. No takers today. All right.
Well, you mentioned this, finding sort of the one objective or the one metric that you're interested in a data set. But I mean, that's not everything, right? But yet again, when we train machine learning models, then we need to have an objective. We need to define some metric that we want to optimize.
one of the things that we may have as a metric, which will be somewhat novel and kind of interesting, is that some sort of portability metric, right? So given that, we could have both zero shot as well as how many annotations does it take to reach X performance on some new data set, right? The efficiency of portability. And so, because what most people are doing with deep forest and our algorithm, right, is using it on data sets we've never seen before. And yeah, it's nice to have zero shot performance, but it's somewhat unrealistic to expect a single model to have this zero shot performance everywhere in the world on trees. It just doesn't seem likely to happen anytime soon. But we would like to measure how portable the backbone is. And so is it how many annotations it takes to get to 80%, or is it how far you are from 80% with some annotations? Like, what is it? It's like some sort of measure of model elasticity. The metaphor I think about is in gene expression, there's something called evolvability that measures how changeable a gene regulation pathway is and how like susceptible to change it is. And we need a measure of evolvability for neural network backbones, how rigid they are and how willing they are to change to new information. That is something we need to be able to assess for deep forest, because people are going to come along with brand new data sets, and we want a backbone which is receptive to new information.
It's interesting. Sounds challenging as well.
Yeah, right.
It's probably
I think we're at 8:05, so I should probably run. But I want to thank everyone for their time. And I am always here for conversation. And so please email me, anybody, if you've got thoughts about absolutely anything. I saw somebody on the channel about trees. And so I will definitely be in touch. And I was just in Sweden giving a set of seminars at Lund, which is how Olaf and I met. And so I'm always around. I appreciate your time, guys. And I'll talk to you later.
Thank you very much, Ben.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye. And to the rest of you, I'll just add that on February 22nd, we have the author of Deep Lab Cut, which was mentioned by Ben in this talk, Alexander Mathis, will be talking then. And next week we have Stefan Bauer from TU Munich. He's going to talk about neural causal models. So welcome back next week, and see you around.